Welcome to What It Takes. I'm Tom Landon. Most of us probably never walked the halls of the old Jefferson High School in Roanoke. The school opened in 1924 to 1,000 students and served the booming Magic City. The home of the Magicians produced many accomplished graduates before closing in 1974, only to sit forlornly until many of those graduates convinced the city to invest in the newly formed Jefferson Center, which reopened its doors in 2001 as a state-of-the-art performance and education facility. Joining me today to talk about the present and the future of the Jefferson Center is Cyrus Pace, Executive Director. Welcome, Cyrus.
Thank you.
Really glad to have you here.
Yeah.
You know, we drive by, those of us who live in Roanoke drive by the Jefferson Center and see that building over there to the right, and I often think what a great thing it is that it is still on the hill there.
Yeah, and doing its thing for Roanoke, which is amazing.
I want to ask, before we get too far into it, I'd just like to start by, let's find out a little bit about you. So
okay.
I know you've had an interesting path to your current position. How did you end up, what led you to where you are now?
Well, gosh, it depends on how far back you want to go, but right out of high school, I went in the Navy, played guitar for the Navy, Navy band, and then once I got out, used the GI Bill to get a sociology degree from Roanoke College, which was great for me, and then actually was going to go to graduate school. I did go to graduate school for a PhD in sociology. I didn't love it, and so instead moved to New York City and got a master's degree in jazz guitar from Manhattan School of Music and stayed for a couple more years. Moved back to Roanoke in 2004 and started getting some work teaching at Roanoke College and Virginia Tech and teaching guitar lessons and playing a lot more gigs than of course I had a chance to when I lived in New York. Eventually I was hired by Dr. Rita Bishop to manage the arts programs for the Roanoke City Public School System, and after doing that for a few years was asked to become the Executive Director at Jefferson Center, which has been 11 years. It's been interesting.
I know that one of my sons took guitar lessons from you many years ago when the music lab was actually located at the Jefferson Center. At the Dumas.
That's right.
The old Dumas. So we go way back. But what did you think about the first time you walked into the Jefferson Center?
So it was probably to see Emmylou Harris with Buddy Miller as a duo. It was something that would have been booked there even before I was involved. I was actually on the board at Jefferson Center when I was asked to become the executive director. But for me, as someone who thought I was on my way to maybe San Francisco or to the West Coast after coming from New York City, it was the idea was that I could probably make a life here because there was enough happening culturally, enough concerts happening. Again, I was playing a lot. There were a couple of years there where I really played 7 nights a week. Christmas Eve, Christmas night, New Year's Eve, New Year's Day night, it didn't matter. So I was playing a lot, but I also knew that there was a critical mass of stuff happening culturally at Jefferson Center that I could take part in and see and do. So it became a livable community for me in that way. And this is an important part of the history, so I should bring it up. The reason that happened is because of Dylan Locke, who really built the model for programming at Jefferson Center, and of course now runs the Floyd Country Store with his wife Heather. So that's a big part of that story and a big part of the reason I would have gone there. And I still think of that performance, by the way, of Emmylou Harris with Buddy Miller. It was just a duo, is one of the most exceptional things I've ever seen live. So we're lucky to have a theater like that in a community like this. And so when given the chance to manage the success of the building and of course the programming, I jumped at it and it's been great.
I think back to some shows I've seen there too. Gillian Welch, David Rawlings jumps out at me as just being you could hear a pin drop, and Esperanza Spalding and so many other good shows. Where does the Jefferson Center, in terms of musical performance venues, fit within what else is here in the Valley?
It's a great question, and that's changed over the last 21 years of programming. Of course, the pandemic year is a lost year in a way. We did do some virtual programming, which was great, but this is our 21st season of programming shows. And what's changed in the interim are there are additional venues online, most important of which, of course, is the Harvester Performance Center in Rocky Mount, which is doing such cool things, and of course the Moss Center being built at Virginia Tech, which is really a preeminent performing arts center, collegiate university performing arts center. So it may be interesting for people to know that it really hasn't affected our business model at all. We still have a group of core subscribers who believe deeply in what we do. We maybe have tweaked the model a little bit and differentiated ourselves somewhat in that programming, but in truth, we're still pretty much following the same model. We do, of course, a lot of jazz, but we do a lot of Americana and bluegrass. Other changes for us is we also took our, what used to be, believe it or not, the female basketball court, which became the rehearsal hall, and made that into a club. We call it Fostek Hall now in honor of a donor who helped us rebuild that space, and we do a club series in there, which is also really cool for our model. But a lot has changed. Roanoke has changed in a lot of ways too.
One of the things that I think is really interesting about what you all do stems from the work at the Music Lab, so that when performers come to town, and I'll let you talk about this,
Yeah.
but what is the Music Lab, and I know you were involved in that very early, and how's that changed over the years?
Yeah, so the Music Lab is part of a bigger program called the Web Education Program, basically. So the Music Lab is one initiative within a broad program where we believe that it's not enough for Wynton Marsalis or maybe Dave Rawlings, as you mentioned, to come to town and make a fee to play for 900 people in the hall, but it's more important that they take time, an hour and a half, and meet with students in our community and and talk through the things that have made their career important, the things that they've learned as they've gone out on the road and done things. I mean, some of the most meaningful for me would be Derek Trucks did a master class with Susan Tedeschi. Branford Marsalis's was amazing. Wynton's was great. Chris Thiele.
I was there for Chris Thiele's.
That was
amazing.
Something. When people are at, you've got kids asking questions of these great masters of their instruments, and hearing the real answers from these guys, it means a lot more than Jordan Harmon, of course, who's our education guy, or me just telling them these things. They're hearing it from someone who folks who have real careers. So that's a big part of our model at the Music Lab. Of course, we also have education outreach concerts. So when we have certain artists, they'll stay for the next morning and do a concert specifically for school kids. We do that as well. We've got performance bands around the Music Lab, individual lessons. But the education program, I think, further makes the argument that when you're here, it needs to be something more than just transactional. Let's really do something that is meaningful for our community, and it's probably the most fun thing that we do. And it's hard for the artists to say no, because they just have to walk up one floor,
Right, if while you're here after the sound check, would you pop in for half an hour and talk to some kids?
Yes, and of course we've gotten better over the years of including that in the contract, so it's non-negotiable once they finally confirm the date. And for the most part, it may be funny for people to know that usually the folks that won't be very good at it self-select themselves out of that opportunity, or the agent will say to you, you don't really want this guy talking up there. So we go, all right, cool, so usually we encourage people to do it, and those who decide to do it and understand why it's meaningful do a great job at that. I'll say for the record that jazz artists are always thinking that way anyway, because they're thinking about the continuation of the art form. So being an educator is much, a part of that gig is being a player. It's
Right.
not just enough to be Esperanza Spalding and write like she does and play like she does and sing like she does, all of that stuff. She realizes she's part of a process of continuing the art by inspiring young people to play the acoustic bass, and play that kind of music.
And just the fact that they're willing to do that, and also, again, I've been to some of those sessions through one of my sons who's a musician, and watching those conversations happen, and the kids are fairly fearless about asking questions. I know that some of the kids have even reached out to some of the musicians and said, would you give me a half an hour on individual lesson, and they've gotten that.
Yeah, one of the greatest lessons I learned in New York was if you go to a club and it's a guitar player you've always wanted to talk to, and you simply stay and say, listen, I'd love to carry your amp out to the taxi, or out to your car, or help you get to where you're going, that 45 minutes you might spend with something is really meaningful. So in a way, we're curating those experiences for students with a music lab, or more broadly in the community for folks. We obviously have adults come often too. But when you hear someone like Chris Thiele sort of demystify the effort for you, when you hear him say, hey, there is no real mystery to this. I've worked really hard. I've been on the road for 15 years straight. I still work on the instrument 4 or 5 hours a day. This is an effort this is a marathon, not a sprint. And we're gonna, allowing kids to think about the discipline of the effort, for me is really important. I'll say this too, it's also increasingly important for, now for kids in their teens and their 20s, millennials and younger, predominantly because they've been, it's a little bold, but they've been sold this idea that the innovators are the most important people of their generation, but I don't know. I think the concept of innovation as it's being used is really sort of comic. I've never seen anything that really matters being anything other than really hard work, synthesizing good information and putting it together. And so I think music as an endeavor and as an educational tool does that better than almost anything. It's not the only thing that does it, but it does it really well.
Before we kind of leave the topic of education, which will probably pop up again, just want to give you a chance to talk about the summer jazz, is it the Jazz Institute?
Yeah.
That program has also really kind of taken on a life of its own.
It has. So it's a week generally in June, where we bring up predominantly the faculty from UNC Greensboro, which has an incredibly good jazz program. The music director, artistic director for the institute is Chad Eby, a great tenor saxophone player and writer. And so it's a chance for mostly high school kids to spend a week with college, university level educators, but not just educators, but great players too. Everyone that comes every year they're the real deal. Guys that I know when I've got a really good gig that pays really well and everybody's going to be treated really well, those are the guys I call because they're the real deal. So the Jazz Institute's definitely a big part of what we do now.
And I know you're the executive director of a big nonprofit here in town, but you're also still playing quite a bit?
I mean, during the pandemic it slowed down, but we're doing a lot of solo guitar gigs, which seem to be more prevalent right now, and so yeah, it's been some. I'm doing less of the club dates because there are less of them, right. But also because those tend to go late, and I like the idea of like playing 6 to 9 and being in bed by 10. That's like perfect for me. I think anymore, but I actually think 2022 calendar year, I'm gonna maybe put together enough material to do another record, because it's been a few years. The last record I did was with my brother, and it was I think almost 10 years ago, so it's time to do something else.
Sure. Let's just shift a little bit to what everybody's thinking about right now, and as we tape this, possibly, again, COVID issues. What were your first thoughts as it became clear in March of 2020 that things were, or 2020, I guess, 2020?
Yeah, I know, it's hard to think back. Yeah. And I think in fiscal years too, so I'm always thinking of the wrong year anyway.
Right. But so, you run a place that depends on foot traffic, people being together, experiencing things at the same time. What went through your mind, and what were some of the first steps you guys took?
Well, I mean, I won't sugarcoat the fact that it, or pretend that it ultimately hasn't been painful. That's really my first thought. And it's been very painful. You think about people who've dedicated their lives to give people the opportunity to experience something analog in a room with other people, and that is instantly taken away from you. So that's been, devastating, really. And even though we've pivoted, which it seems like sort of an overused term these days,
sure.
But
pivot probably should be the word of the year.
Exactly,
not, right?
Exactly. And we used, what we needed to do as an opportunity to make some changes and kind of refocus our efforts. None of those decisions were easy, and frankly, none of those decisions weren't without some level of impact on human beings. And even when we've developed our COVID protocols for how people experience live music in our hall and the stuff that we think is the safe way to to get people back together again. All of that stuff has been, politicized and sensationalized in ways that just haven't been helpful. And I think that, as the pandemic has gone on, that's been the real weight of it. I'm not complaining, because that's the job and role I've been given, but it's been surprising, honestly, how much of the pushback has been the level of sort of, vitriol that's come around that conversation. So I remind people that at Jefferson Center we have a couple of goals that are primary, and goal 1 is to be kind, and goal 2 is to care for people. And then we also want to have some music and performing arts happening in our spaces. So I think when we think back on our values and we think back on how we want to treat people, and we hope that that energy filters out and people understand that even though those decisions may not fit with their particular ideology, I do want them to understand that our intent is just to try to do the right thing.
Well, and to stay open, and I know in addition to, thinking about your patrons who are very important to you, you've got a staff, you've got people in your building who you have to worry about and be concerned about and stay awake at night worrying about. How were you able to keep your team together during the shutdown?
Some yes and some no. We went from 13 full-time employees to 6 full-time employees within a 2-month period. So we made some difficult decisions, and every one of those was challenging. Monday morning quarterback, of course, you always think back and want to be sure that you handle those conversations in the most kind way that you can, and you were caring for people. But I am proud of the way we handled those things, and I'm also proud of the fact that we still continue to position Jefferson Center in terms of our balance sheet and our programmatic efforts and our, and where we've restaffed and how we've restructured. We're more prepared than we've ever been to do the right thing for the community. So I feel really good about that. The only thing I might also mention is I think everyone in any industry, any sector in America has realized that a lot more care was owed to our employees than maybe we realized before. That that we need to be thinking about mental health of the folks that work for us, and particularly again in the performing arts and a sector, it's the live music business too, a sector where people's, at least their professional self-identity was wrapped up in this idea that we present shows, we present opportunities for people to be in a room together. So we've worked hard to make sure that we prioritize mental health for our staff and that we have conversations about well-being, and I think that's one of the things that'll stick for hopefully corporate America too. I think that's important to have those conversations.
And then in addition to performance and music and all of that going on at the Jefferson Center, you're also home to a lot of other organizations, right, which may or may not be related in any way to that.
So we think of it's kind of the rental program, but our rental program has multiple facets. Primarily, people probably know our performance hall, the Chapman Performance Hall, where we host the Virginia Children's Theater, the Roanoke Symphony, Opera Roanoke, Roanoke Ballet Theater, and many others. So those are organizations that benefit from the existence of Chapman Performance Hall or other performance spaces. And I think it's an important reminder for people that it's not just we're providing them a show, we're providing them a million of things, whether it's selling tickets for them, providing front of house, which is your experience from your car to your seat, right? Whether the bar works well for you, everything from parking to security. And then you think back at the house, you think of the production folks necessary to make these performances successful. So it's something we're really proud of. That's the thing that's most visible thing we do probably, but we also have 20 tenants in the building who have commercial leasing space. And that's a big part of our revenue generation on an annual basis. And then thirdly, we also, of course, have spaces that we lease for short-term events, which you might think of as birthdays, bar mitzvahs, and weddings, and that sort of thing as well, which we're really proud of that work too, because it provides space for people that, for things that are important to them. So when we use the term community center, right, that's really what it is. It's a place for people to come and have analog experiences together in a room doing stuff that hopefully creates memories for them.
What are some of the special challenges of it being a building that was originally constructed a long time
I
ago.
appreciate that question. So it's a 110,000 square foot building, again, as you said, built in the early 1920s. So some things are just structurally difficult, like it's a flat roof with a lot of square footage, and that's always going to be a concern and an issue and a challenge. There's also a lot of common area in a building because it's an old high school, so the hallways are huge because they'd be used to every kid in the high school moving through the hallways at the same time between periods, right? So heating and cooling those spaces is tricky. But there's good news. All of the different revenue streams and all of the different kinds of contributed support we get make a very sustainable operational model.
So you're not all dependent on just ticket sales or...
Exactly. So over the long haul, that's a very smart business model. I think that the challenge for Jefferson Center will continue to be what it's always been, which is how do you retain enough capital reserves, right? Do you just assume you're going to do a capital campaign every 10 years or 15 years to take care of deferred capital maintenance? Or is there a better model? Initially, I think that model is probably continuing to fund our endowment structure, make sure we've, go from 1.5 million in the bank to more like 4 or 5 million in the bank, that we're constantly offsetting cash from those investment accounts. So that's a goal we're looking at, and there are other options as well, but sustainability in terms of capital infrastructure is something we have yet to solve, and we're still looking at those options.
Sure, when something's almost 100 years old, you have to look long into the future.
Yeah.
I feel like I'd be remiss if I didn't say, when Jefferson was founded in the 20s, it was a whites-only school, as every, at that point, almost every public school in Virginia was. But that continued on through until integration happened. What do you do to, and I know you do things, but what do you do to make sure that the entire community feels welcome in that space?
It's a great question. Let me start by being honest with you about some mistakes we've made. We've made the mistake of believing because we're presenting black artists or jazz, for example, that that's going to be interesting to the black community. It seems really naive now and almost embarrassing to admit that, but we're doing a better job of saying, hey, this is something that we think matters. Does it matter to you? So really having that conversation with diverse communities and having a conversation about ticket pricing, having a conversation about access is really important. And then, we monitor it. That's the other part. We look at data and we say, here's a show where we were hoping for a diverse audience. How did that end up looking? Well, and then really you can ask the question, what are the hurdles to attendance? If it's just as simple as that artist wasn't interesting to me, well, that's actually pretty easy to solve. But if it's bigger hurdles, like, as you mentioned, this sort of historic perspective that, it was a white high school for white folks, well, does that still exist? And is that something we still need to overcome? And how do we do that? In general, I'll say I don't have any trepidation, any concern, any anxiety about telling you I still think we have incredibly diverse audiences. When we had Gladys Knight most recently, it was the most diverse audience I've ever seen in a venue in Roanoke, and it was an amazing night. So I don't know if there are necessarily any solutions that are, how do you say, there are no specific ways to solve diversity one way or another. Just keep having the conversation, keep wondering if you're doing it right, and make sure you're listening to feedback from your community.
So I notice, as I look at the artists who are coming to the Jefferson Center at any given time, it's a little different. You don't appear to just be chasing ticket sales, and yet those are important. We've got a couple minutes left here. Yeah. So how do you, when you are building that program, what do you look for? Are you trying to balance, how much do you have to think about, will we sell enough tickets for this?
Well, so everything is built on a projection. It starts from the offer point. So if we want to have whatever, Sam Bush or Pat Metheny or Shamika Copeland, whoever it is, it starts from you presenting an offer to the agency that says, here's what we think we can sell in this market at these ticket pricing. And that, of course, gets built into an annual budget, which includes 13, 20, 25, 30 shows, right? So you're thinking of it holistically, but you're also thinking about it on the individual level. But the primary mission is to present things of quality. So that's the first filter. Is it something that I want to go see? Is it something that wouldn't otherwise be presented in this market? And is it something that's exceptional that we feel proud to give the community access to. And if it gets through that filter, I continue to believe that we'll figure out the money filter. You know, we can figure out how to pencil it out so it makes sense financially. That always makes sense.
So it's not just promotion, it's curation to a
It's
certain
curation. It's actually mostly curation, because the business side of it is not fun. I don't like that part of it, you know. But turns out I feel really confident in my negotiation, and the market can pay what the market can pay for the artists, and that's just what it is.
We're almost out of time
Yeah.
now, but you know, what do you, if you had like one thing to tell somebody who's never been to the Jefferson Center, hasn't thought about it, what would you encourage them to do?
I'd say that Jefferson Center is probably one of the coolest things about living in the Roanoke Valley. So it's a quick way to add to your cultural landscape and to have experiences that might surprise you. You don't have to get in the train and go 9 hours to New York City. You can do it here in Roanoke.
Great. Well, thanks. Shockingly, there's our time.
Yeah.
I would like to thank Cyrus Pace for joining me today. If you'd like to learn more about upcoming performances or the many other things that take place at Jefferson Center, I encourage you to visit their website at jeffcenter.org. For What It Takes, I'm Tom Landon.